The earth drank deeply that day, not with rain, not with river water, but with the blood of kings. A body lay broken on the endless steppe, the body of the most powerful man the world had ever known. His empire stretched from the shores of the Aegean to the mountains of India, a kingdom forged from fire and mercy in equal measure. Cyrus the Great, liberator of Babylon, conqueror of nations, architect of the Persian Empire, was dead. But it was not his death that haunted those who survived. It was what came after. A woman stood over him, not a queen in golden robes, but a warlord cloaked in dust and grief. She had lost her son to his deception, and in that moment she demanded a payment no empire could afford. Her name was Tomyris, queen of the Massagetae, a people dismissed as savages, yet feared for the ferocity of their rage. She swore she would give Cyrus his fill of blood, and she kept her word in a ritual so brutal, so precise, that it shattered the very idea of what vengeance could mean. This is not the tale told in Persian courts or carved on imperial tablets. This is the forgotten counter-legend of a nomadic queen who humbled the greatest conqueror alive, and whose justice was written not in marble or myth, but in blood. The world had never seen a man like him. Cyrus was not born into greatness. He bent the world until it broke around him. Kingdom after kingdom fell before his step, their walls splintering, their crowns lowered, their gods swallowed whole. He carved empires as if with a single blade, and when his blade was sheathed, he conquered with silence, mercy, and the illusion of choice. To his enemies he was both liberator and jailer, savior and executioner, a figure whose shadow reached farther than the horizon itself. The Babylonians whispered his name with reverence. The Lydians cursed it with regret. To the peoples of the ancient world, he was no longer flesh, no longer mortal. He was the storm itself, relentless, all-consuming, inevitable. He freed the enslaved. He preserved the conquered. He returned kings to their thrones, only to remind them that it was his hand that kept them there. To stand before Cyrus was to stand before history itself, a force that asked no permission and gave no apology. The empire he built stretched wider than any that had existed, from the Mediterranean waters that stank of salt and war, across deserts where bones cracked beneath the sun, to the mountains that clawed at the sky in the east. All of it bore his mark. 30 years of campaigns, each one more daring, each one a stone in the monument he carved to himself. Men believed him chosen, touched by the divine. They called him King of Kings. They told themselves that such a man could not fall, that the earth itself bent to his command. His armies believed this lie most of all, for they had seen no other truth. They had marched behind him through dust storms and rivers of fire. They had slaughtered cities and knelt beside him as he forgave them. He was both blade and balm, a contradiction that worked only because he had never been defeated. Yet power feeds on itself. Every victory made the next campaign seem inevitable. Every conquered throne another stepping stone towards something greater, though none could name what lay beyond. Cyrus no longer asked should he take a land, only when his empire expanded like a chest inhaling, wider and wider, but every breath must one day be released. There was a pride in him, quiet but growing, the pride of a man who had begun to believe his own legend. He had seen kings crumble in tears, cities kneel without a fight, and he mistook their weakness for proof of his destiny. To Cyrus, no people were too wild, no land too remote, no ruler too defiant. He had remade the world once, he would remake it again. But even storms exhaust themselves. Even mountains are worn down by time. Somewhere beyond his gaze stretched a horizon he could not command, a place where no empire's banners flew, where warriors drank blood with their milk and called the god of war their father. To them, his titles meant nothing. His mercy meant weakness. His empire was a rumor, and rumors do not conquer. The juggernaut of the world was still moving forward, unstoppable in appearance, but within that momentum was the seed of collapse. Every empire believes itself eternal until it meets the silence that does not yield. And for Cyrus, that silence waited in the endless grasslands of the steppe, a silence carried by hoofbeats, sharpened by arrows, and led by a woman whose grief would eclipse his glory. The steppe was not a land. It was an ocean of grass, without shore, without boundary, without mercy. No walls to hide behind, no cities to cling to, no rivers wide enough to serve as chains. Only wind, dust, and the unbroken horizon. It was a place that devoured the unprepared, where a single mistake meant bones bleaching in silence. To survive here required more than strength. It required a kind of cruelty that was inseparable from life itself. The Massagetae were born into this world as if carved from it. From the moment an infant first opened its lungs to the thin, biting air, the lessons began. Hunger was the first teacher. The second was the horse. The child who could not cling to a galloping mane was already half dead. The child who could not notch an arrow before speech would never see adulthood. To live was to fight. To fight was to live. Nothing more, nothing less. Blood was not metaphor, it was sustenance. They mixed it with milk and drank it warm, a ritual of survival and faith. To outsiders it seemed grotesque, barbaric, but to the people of the steppe, blood was life itself, proof that nothing was wasted, not even death. They lived by the bow, by the spear, by the raid, by the ceaseless pursuit of cattle that fed their hunger and leather that clothed their skin. And unlike the civilizations that circled them, they did not confine women to shadows. A daughter might hold the same bow as her brother. A wife might ride in the same raid as her husband. To lead was not inherited but seized, not through crowns or documents, but by the test of blood spilled in combat. Authority was not gifted by lineage. It was earned by terror, by resilience, by scars carved deep into flesh. They moved like smoke. Villages vanished with the seasons, leaving only trampled earth behind. Camps rose where herds found grass and dissolved when the earth grew dry. They needed no walls, no monuments. Their monument was survival itself, their legacy written in raids, their stories carried not on stone, but in the veins of their children. For those who came from kingdoms of stone and law, the Massagetae were a nightmare dressed as humanity. They bowed to no king, accepted no god but war, acknowledged no permanence but the blade. Where Persia built cities of marble, the steppe people built nothing. Where Persia sought to tame the world with roads, tribute, and order, the nomads lived in defiance of all chains. They laughed at the promises of empire. They mocked the idea that mercy was strength. In their world, the strong took, and the weak vanished without echo. It was not cruelty, it was truth. To Persians, they were savages who worshipped chaos. But to themselves, they were the freest people alive. They needed no empire to protect them, no priest to guide them, no ruler to define them. Their God was the endless sky, their church the open grass, their scripture the clash of steel in the hunt. And above them all stood a woman whose rise had been carved in the same merciless pattern. Tomyris, born to the dust, shaped by the bow, elevated not by inheritance but by blood. Her crown was not of gold but of scars. Her throne was not stone but a saddle. She ruled not by decree, but because none dared to stand against her. To Persia, she would seem like a shadow wearing the shape of a queen. But to the people of the steppe, she was the embodiment of their truth, that only through blood and survival could one claim to lead. The horizon belonged to her now, vast and untamed, waiting for the storm that would soon come. The message did not arrive on the tip of a sword. It came wrapped in silk, perfumed with the faint sweetness of foreign oils, heavy with promises that carried the scent of chains. Cyrus had conquered with steel, But just as often he conquered with marriage, offering a hand that appeared tender but always pressed down with the weight of empire. He had learned long ago that a bride could be a bridge, that a queen's surrender could be dressed in the softness of a wedding veil. To him, the offer was simple. He would marry Tomyris, and the wild expanse of the steppe would kneel to Persia without blood. No more raids, no more cattle stolen beneath moonlight. Only obedience, silk over leather, law over dust, a queen at his side, but a queen caged, her throne absorbed into his empire, her people reduced to subjects. To Cyrus, it was not a proposal, it was inevitability clothed as courtesy. The words traveled across the river, across the windswept plains, until they reached her. To most rulers of the known world, such an offer would have been salvation. To be bound to Cyrus was to be untouchable, protected by the shadow of the greatest empire alive. But for Tomyris, the message stank of humiliation. She saw the strings tied to every word, the way his hand stretched not to lift her, but to pull her under. She was no stranger to the workings of kings. She had seen the eyes of captured rulers, the way they flickered between gratitude and terror when Cyrus allowed them to live. She knew what it meant to be absorbed into his empire. It was not love he offered, but erasure, the slow suffocation of everything her people were, their blood rituals, their freedom on horseback, their worship of the open sky. Marriage to Cyrus was not alliance. It was extinction delivered in honeyed tones. Her reply was not soft. She refused him with the clarity of steel striking flint. No silk, no hesitation, no veil to cover the insult. Her words carried across the plains like a blade drawn in the dark. She would not kneel, not as a wife, not as a queen, not as a mother of warriors. If Persians crossed her river, they would find only death waiting. For Cyrus, it was more than rejection. It was an insult carved into the flesh of his pride. No king had ever denied him in such terms. Kings yielded, cities opened their gates, thrones bent. But this was a barbarian queen, a woman wrapped in dust and scars, daring to refuse the king of kings. To his ears, it was not defiance, it was mockery. The refusal spread through his court like smoke. Advisors whispered, soldiers muttered, the sting of it settling deep in every Persian heart. To them, it was inconceivable that such people, nomads without cities, without monuments, could look at Persia's grandeur and say no. Her voice was more dangerous than her armies because it shattered the illusion of inevitability upon which his empire rested. Tomyris had done what no king of Babylon, no ruler of Lydia, no monarch of distant lands had ever dared. She had spoken a single word, and in it was the weight of defiance, the declaration that some things could not be conquered, not by steel, not by silk, not by vows. And from that word flowed an inevitability darker than any wedding. Rejection had cut deeper than any blade. Cyrus would answer not with flowers or patience, but with the only language left to him. The silence of refusal would soon be filled with the thunder of war. The silence before betrayal is always strangely gentle. The Persians crossed the river as if nothing could stop them, their armor gleaming, their banners heavy with the promise of empire. Ahead of them, the Massagetae seemed to scatter like frightened birds. Fires abandoned, horses driven away, the land falling quiet as if the nomads had surrendered to fear. Cyrus believed he had seen this before, the collapse of courage before his shadow. But what he followed was not retreat, it was invitation. He advanced deeper into the steppe, where the air grew thin and the land stretched endless. Each horizon identical to the last. Days of pursuit ended at a camp left almost defenseless, its warriors melting away with token resistance. The Persians stormed the place easily, and in its center they found what seemed like a gift from the gods themselves. Wine, great vats of it, sealed and waiting, a treasure no nomad could have carried willingly. The Massagetae lived on mare's milk, blood, and the flesh of their herds. They did not drink wine. It dulled the senses, made warriors clumsy, unwary. But to Persians, wine was celebration, luxury, the blood of victory itself. They opened the vessels, and the air filled with the sweet, heavy scent of grapes, intoxicating even before the first sip touched their lips. The soldiers drank, first in cautious gulps, then in greedy floods, the weight of exhaustion slipping from their shoulders, replaced with laughter, with the roar of triumph. Songs rose into the night, loud and careless. Fires were lit high, shadows staggering in drunken dances. The empire had swallowed another people, and they believed the taste of it was sweet. But beneath the din of revelry, another sound echoed, chains clinking softly. For among the prisoners taken in the feigned skirmish was a youth of striking presence, Spargapises, son of Tomyris, a prince by blood, a warrior by trial. He had fought with the ferocity of the steppe, but had been dragged down, bound, and thrown into the hands of his mother's enemy. For Cyrus, the capture was triumph beyond measure. He held not only the son of his rival, but the key to her obedience. To parade this youth before her would mean humiliation. To keep him breathing was to keep her chained by maternal fear. In his mind, the game was already won. But Cyrus had never understood the people of the grasslands. He thought survival was the same as submission, that a mother would bow to save her child. He did not know the iron that ran through their veins, that to the Massagetae bondage was a fate more bitter than death. Spargapises endured his capture in silence, his eyes hollow with a knowledge the Persians mistook for despair. Yet inside him a war raged. He had been trained since boyhood that a warrior's life was not his own to lose carelessly, but neither could it be bartered like cattle. His hands, bruised and bound, trembled not with fear but with the rage of dishonor. When Cyrus mocked him with offers of mercy, when soldiers jeered and poured wine to taunt the son of the steppe queen, Spargapises asked only one thing: to have his bonds loosened, if only for a moment. Perhaps Cyrus thought it was submission at last, a request for breath, for comfort. The ties were loosened, and in that moment, the boy seized his own ending. Before anyone could move, Spargapises drove steel into his flesh. The act was swift, almost silent, the release of a man who would not be used as a chain against his mother. Blood spilled onto Persian soil, hot and unyielding. His body convulsed once, then stilled, the echo of his choice hanging heavier than the drunken laughter still drifting through the camp. To Cyrus, it was incomprehensible. To his soldiers, it was a chill colder than night wind. But to Tomyris, when word reached her across the plains, it was a wound deeper than any blade could carve. Her son had chosen death over captivity, honor over life. And though grief hollowed her, it also sharpened her into something the Persians could not imagine. For when a mother has lost her child, and that loss is soaked in humiliation, what remains is no longer merely human. What remains is vengeance. And vengeance waits with patience, sharpening itself in silence until the blood debt is paid in full. Night lay heavy over the steppe. The wind moved like a whisper across the grass, carrying with it the scent of smoke, of iron, of grief that clung to every breath. Somewhere in the darkness a mother sat alone, her body upright, her face unbending, but inside her the world had already collapsed. Tomyris had not wept, not before her warriors, not before the sky. Her son's blood had vanished into foreign soil, and her grief had been hammered into something harder than sorrow. She took no comfort in ritual mourning. There was no room for lament when the living demanded justice from the dead. Instead, she summoned words sharp as blades and sent them riding towards Cyrus. Her message was simple, but it carried the weight of a curse. She named him bloodthirsty. She told him not to revel in his hollow victory, not to be intoxicated by the wine that had destroyed her son. She warned him that what he thought was triumph was only poison in his veins. Then, with a calmness that cut deeper than rage, she swore by the sun itself, the god of her people, the lord of the open sky, that she would give him what he so clearly craved. She would give him his fill of blood. These were not the empty threats of a humiliated queen to the Massagetae. Blood was sacred. It was life force, the essence of strength, the bond between the living and the gods. Her vow was not rhetoric, it was ritual. By speaking it aloud, she bound herself to it as surely as if she had carved it into her own flesh. For Cyrus, these words were little more than barbarian bravado, the snarling of a beaten foe. But for those who knew the weight of steppe oaths, the silence after her vow was unbearable. It was the silence of prophecy. In that silence, her warriors felt their grief turn to steel. They felt the promise coil around them like armor, sealing them to their queen's vengeance. To disobey now would not only betray her, it would betray the gods, the sky, the memory of her son. From that moment, every rider, every archer, every spear-bearer carried not only their own fury, but the burden of her vow. Tomyris had spoken, and the steppe itself seemed to hold its breath. There would be no forgiveness, no bargaining, no retreat. And somewhere, across the plains where Persian fires still flickered with drunken triumph, death was already waiting. Dawn broke cold and pale. The sun rose weakly, casting long blades of light across the endless grasslands. The Persian camp stirred with the groans of men, heavy from wine, their mouths dry, their limbs dulled, their pride still swollen with the illusion of victory. The air smelled of ash and sour drink, of bodies unwashed and armor carelessly discarded. They believed the danger had passed. They believed the nomads had fled. But the steppe does not forget, it watches, it waits. The first sign came not with sound, but with movement. Shadows gliding across the horizon, horsemen riding low, dust rising behind them like a second dawn. At first they seemed scattered, a few dozen riders darting in and out of sight. Then the ground itself seemed to tremble. Thousands, a swarm without beginning or end, spreading across the grass like fire across dry wheat. The Persians scrambled, armor clinking, hands fumbling for weapons. Orders barked, half heard through the panic. They formed their lines as they always had, heavy shields, bronze and iron, ranks meant to withstand the charge of disciplined armies. But what came for them was not an army of stone. It was a storm made flesh. The Massagetae rode at full gallop, their ponies snorting white breath into the morning air. The whistle of bowstrings cut through the sky, and then came the arrows, black, endless, falling like rain. They struck shields, pierced armor, found flesh, the air filled with screams, the smell of blood mingling with horse sweat and churned earth. Cyrus's men braced for impact, waiting for the enemy to break upon their walls of iron. But no charge came. The nomads did not collide. They circled, they vanished, then reappeared, loosing arrow after arrow before disappearing again into the horizon. The Persians struck at ghosts, slashing at air, charging at enemies who melted away before steel could find them. Hours dragged into eternity. Each moment bled into the next, punctuated by the whistle of arrows, the cries of the wounded, the thundering hooves that never seemed to stop. Heat rose from the ground, choking, merciless, as bodies collapsed beneath the weight of armor too heavy for the dance of the steppe. Cyrus himself rode among his men, shouting, urging, pleading for cohesion. His voice carried strength, but even he could not stitch together what was already unraveling. The Massagetae had chosen the battlefield well. Open plains, rivers at their backs, no refuge, no shelter. Every Persian step forward led only deeper into the trap. And through it all, Tomyris's vow hung over the carnage like an invisible crown. Her warriors fought not as individuals, but as instruments of her promise. Each arrow loosed was a thread in the tapestry of her oath. each Persian death a stitch of blood binding her vow to reality. Some say Cyrus fought to the very end, his sword slick with blood, his eyes blazing with the fury of a man who had never tasted defeat. Others claim he fell to an arrow before he could strike again. No one truly knows. What is certain is that when the dust settled, the storm had passed, and the Persian lines had shattered into silence. The battlefield was a graveyard. Persian bodies littered the ground, their armor broken, their mouths filled with dust. Horses lay twisted in grotesque shapes, arrows protruding like thorns from their hides. The smell of iron and death hung thick, clinging to every breath. The empire that had believed itself eternal had been broken, scattered to the winds by the very people they had called barbarians. And somewhere among the fallen, Cyrus the Great, King of Kings, master of half the known world, lay still. His legend ended not in marble palaces or triumphal parades, but face down in the dust of a land he had never understood. The sky had rained arrows, and the earth had swallowed an empire. Yet for Tomyris, the battle was not enough. Victory alone could not cleanse the wound. The promise she had spoken still demanded its final act, and until it was fulfilled, the steppe would not rest. The battle was over, but silence did not bring peace. The plain was a sea of corpses, the air rank with the sweetness of rot already blooming under the rising sun. Ravens circled, their wings black slashes against the pale sky, waiting to descend upon the dead who could no longer defend themselves. But Tomyris did not leave the field to carrion. She walked among the bodies, her face unshaken, her eyes fixed not on the countless dead, but on one body alone. Cyrus. The King of Kings lay stripped of majesty, armor torn, flesh pierced, his crown nowhere to be seen. For all his power, for all his conquests, in the end he was indistinguishable from any other fallen soldier. Dust coated his skin, his blood mingled with that of men whose names would never be remembered. But Tomyris had not forgotten her vow. Her words had bound her, and the gods of the steppe demanded their payment in full. She ordered her warriors to cut off his head. The blade moved without ceremony, severing flesh and bone in one brutal sweep. The weight of it was strange, heavy yet strangely light, as though the soul had already fled. His eyes, half-lidded, stared without recognition, emptied of command, emptied of defiance. To the Persians, he had been more than mortal, but in her hands, he was only a man. A wineskin was brought forward, swollen with the blood of Persian dead. The smell of it was metallic, raw, almost unbearable. Thick, dark, still warm in places. It was not spilled in chaos, but gathered deliberately, a ritual offering. For the Massagetae, blood was more than fluid. It was spirit, essence, the very thread that bound the living to the eternal. To drown Cyrus in it was not simply cruelty, it was judgment. Tomyris held his head above the skin, her grip unflinching. Then, with a voice that cut through the moans of the dying and the silence of the slain, she spoke, "I am alive, and I have conquered you in battle. Yet you destroyed me by treachery, by taking my son. I swore to give you your fill of blood. Now drink, and drink your fill." With those words, she thrust his head deep into the wineskin, submerging it in the blood of his own men. It sank beneath the surface, swallowed whole, the liquid spilling over the edges as if the earth itself had taken part in the act. The soldiers of the steppe watched in silence. None spoke, none intervened. They understood what they witnessed, not merely vengeance, but fulfillment. Her oath had been kept. Her son's honor had been avenged. Cyrus, the man who thought himself eternal, had been bound in death to the very substance he had spilled so freely in life. To outsiders it would appear barbaric, grotesque beyond imagination. To the Massagetae, it was balance restored. The blood he thirsted for in conquest had been forced upon him in death, not in triumph, but in humiliation. His spirit would wander, never quenched, never released, forever trapped in the cycle of thirst and drowning. The act was not rage. It was cold, deliberate, sacred. It was the final stroke in a story written not in marble or on tablets, but in earth and blood. And when it was done, the silence deepened, pressing heavy against the chest. For even those who believed in vengeance felt the weight of what they had seen. A king had been erased. A mother had kept her vow. And in the eyes of the living, the world would never again seem as secure as it had under his shadow. But the shadow had been drowned, and in its place, something darker began to take shape. The death of a king should have been marked by ritual, by temples, by the solemn silence of courtiers who dared not breathe too loudly in the shadow of loss. But there was no temple for Cyrus, no procession of priests to chant his greatness into eternity. His body lay torn on foreign soil, his head defiled, his name spat back to his empire on the tongues of survivors who had fled the slaughter. When word reached Persia, it came not as rumor but as a wound. Messengers carried it in their eyes before their mouths spoke the words. Cyrus the Great, undefeated, untouchable, was gone, slain by nomads whose very existence the empire had dismissed as trivial. The unthinkable had happened, and with it the illusion of invincibility shattered. Whispers spread like cracks through marble. If Cyrus could fall, then what was Persia but flesh? What was empire but dust, arranged in the shape of eternity? His soldiers had believed themselves bound to destiny. Now they were bound to grief. His court had believed in the permanence of his reign. Now they looked upon one another with suspicion, already calculating the succession, already fearing the unraveling. His son Cambyses would claim the throne, but the shadow of inheritance was no substitute for the fire of conquest. The court muttered of omens, of curses, of the gods withdrawing their favor. Cyrus had been more than a ruler. He had been the symbol of Persia's inevitability. His absence left not only a crown unfilled, but a void, a hollowness at the center of the empire. And in that void, fear grew. The empire still stretched vast. Its armies still numbered in tens of thousands. Its wealth still poured from conquered lands. But it had been touched by mortality, by the simple truth that no empire was eternal. Beyond its borders lay people who did not kneel, who could not be softened by gifts or promises. The steppe had swallowed its greatest king, and it had spat him back in pieces. The northern frontier was abandoned, left to the endless grass and the memory of humiliation. Never again would Persia attempt to chain the nomads of the steppe. The horizon itself seemed cursed, the very air of that land carrying the taste of vengeance. Yet the empire endured. It continued to expand in other directions, to forge new wars, new victories. But no victory could cleanse the stain of this defeat. For the story of Cyrus's death traveled faster than any army. Traders whispered it in markets. Enemies recited it as prayer. Allies remembered it in silence. His end became a warning carved into the bones of empire. Pride was not immortality. Conquest was not destiny. And even the mightiest throne could topple into the dust. Persia trembled, not because it had fallen, but because it now knew it could. Her vengeance did not end with Cyrus's head submerged in blood. That act was only the beginning of her immortality. The Massagetae did not carve statues or raise monuments. They left no marble inscriptions, no palaces to echo their rulers' names. Their legacy lived in the marrow of those who remembered, carried forward by breath, by story, by the shudder in a soldier's voice when he spoke of what he had seen. And through that living memory, Tomyris became more than a queen. She became a force. To the Persians who survived, she was terror incarnate, the woman who had humbled the king of kings, the mother whose grief was sharper than any sword. They whispered her name with bitterness, with awe, with fear. Every retelling of her vengeance grew darker, more grotesque, until her image was less human than elemental, like the storm that breaks the mountain, or the river that swallows armies whole. To the nomads of the steppe, she was proof that no empire was invincible, that their way of life, fleeting, fragile, scorned by the settled, could endure against even the greatest power on earth. Mothers pointed to her when they placed bows in the hands of their daughters. Fathers spoke her name when they taught their sons to ride until their thighs burned and their lungs cracked with the cold wind. She was the embodiment of survival, of defiance, of vengeance, sanctified by the gods of the sky. Her tactics became legend. The use of the land itself as weapon, the refusal to fight on imperial terms, the lure of deception, the strike and vanish of cavalry that dissolved like smoke. What she wove into battle would echo for centuries, in the charges of Scythians, in the ambushes of Huns, in the thundering storms of Mongol horsemen who would one day bring empires to their knees. Her blood vow, her unrelenting wrath, became the inheritance of 1,000 tribes who refused to bow. But her true legacy was more than strategy. It was the terrible clarity of what grief can make of a human being. To lose a son was sorrow enough. To lose him to deception was an agony beyond words. Yet she did not crumble. She transformed. She took her wound and shaped it into a blade sharp enough to cut an empire apart. In her, motherhood and war fused into something unprecedented. A vengeance so complete it could not be dismissed as savagery, nor softened as tragedy. Even the Greeks, who knew nothing of the steppe but rumor and fear, preserved her story in their chronicles. To them she was both barbarian queen and moral lesson, a reminder that pride finds its end in unexpected places, that power invites its own undoing. They repeated the tale not out of love for her, but out of fascination, out of horror, out of the recognition that something in her defiance revealed the limits of kings. Her name did not vanish. It moved like a ghost across centuries, a whisper on the wind of the steppe. Tomyris, the queen who drowned Cyrus in blood, the mother who chose vengeance over surrender, the ruler who proved that empire itself could bleed. In the end, her legacy is not marble or empire. It is memory, raw, brutal, unsoftened. It is the lingering taste of iron in the mouth, the vision of a severed head submerged in a wineskin, the silence of soldiers who once believed their master immortal. It is the lesson that no throne, no crown, no king is safe from the reckoning born of grief. And when the steppe winds rise, carrying dust across the horizon, one might still imagine her voice within it, cold, unbending, eternal, a promise kept, a warning left behind.